Here is the complete story with all part separators removed for a continuous narrative. Their final defense collapsed, then Earth ships appeared. The war was over. Admiral Vorian had not yet given the order to retreat, but he knew the truth of it in the cold stillness of his bones. On the bridge of the dreadnought Radiant Dawn, the last bastion of a dying strategy, the silence was more damning than any scream. His fleet, the pride of the Cyrran hegemony, hung in the void like scattered jewels, their brilliant energy lances spitting defiance at an enemy that did not care. Each beam of coherent light, powerful enough to glass a continent, struck the fractal hulls of the Xylos ships and simply vanished, absorbed into their strange geometric structures without so much as a flare of displaced energy. The Xylos did not return fire in kind. They did not need to. They simply advanced, their silent, impassive progress a more potent psychological weapon than any torpedo. Vorian stood before the main view screen, his slender frame rigid, hands clasped behind his back. The medals of valor on his deep blue uniform were a mockery, relics of a time when courage and strategy were forces that could shape the outcome of a battle. Now they were merely ornaments. He watched a Cyrran cruiser, the glimmering blade, unleash a full-power-to-weapons barrage, its primary cannons painting the void in incandescent violet. The Xylos dreadnought it targeted did not even shudder. It continued its inexorable drift forward, and secondary crystalline shards detached from its main body, striking the blade with surgical precision. The cruiser's shields, designed to stop plasma and particle beams, flared uselessly against the physical impact. The ship tumbled, crippled, its drive flaring in a death agony before it went dark. "Blade is unresponsive," the tactical officer reported, his voice a tight monotone. "Shields are failing on the third wing. They're being targeted by shard volleys." "And the planetary shield?" Vorian asked, his gaze fixed on the shimmering dome that protected Cyrra, his homeworld. Below that shield, billions of souls waited for a miracle. The engineering officer, a grim-faced female with her silver hair tied in a tight bun, shook her head. "The generators are running at 400% capacity. They cannot sustain the absorption load. Minutes, Admiral. We have minutes at best." Every Cyrran on the bridge understood. Their entire philosophy of warfare, refined over 1,000 years of energy-based combat, was useless. They had built the perfect sword, only to face an enemy made of water. The Xylos were a force of nature, a geological event disguised as a fleet. Vorian's mind cycled through the options, each one a different shade of despair. Surrender? The Xylos did not take prisoners. They did not communicate. They simply erased. Evacuation? There were not enough ships, not enough time. His fleet was being dismantled. His planet was about to be broken open, and all he could do was watch. He felt the immense weight of his failure settle upon his shoulders. It was then that the sensor technician, a young male at the aft station, stiffened. "Admiral, unidentified FTL transition. High-mass signatures, a dozen of them." Vorian's head snapped around. "Xylos reinforcements?" It was the only logical and most dreadful possibility. "No, sir," the technician replied, his large eyes wide with confusion. "The drive signatures, they're chaotic, nothing on record. High energy, but a dirty burn. Inefficient." He tapped his console, bringing the newcomers into focus on a secondary screen. Vorian stared. The ships were an offense to every principle of Cyrran design. Where his vessels were sleek, elegant curves of gleaming alloy, these were brutalist blocks of dark metal, scarred and functional. They were asymmetrical, bristling with strange mechanical appendages and what looked like massive armored cannons. There was no grace to them, no artistry. They looked less like starships and more like repurposed industrial machinery, their hulls thick and pitted, suggesting a history of enduring brute force rather than deflecting energy. A single stark symbol was painted on the lead ship's prow, a white circle filled with blue, streaked with continents of green and brown. "They're hailing us," the communications officer interrupted. "No, wait, they're broadcasting a wide-beam identification packet. Designation, Terran Defense Force. Flagship, UNF Unrelenting." Terran. Human. The name was vaguely familiar, a minor species from an isolated arm of the galaxy, noted in the Cyrran archives as being primitive and fractious, still reliant on crude chemical rockets and internal combustion. They were a footnote in the grand sweep of galactic history. Yet here they were, in the heart of Syrra's final battle, their ugly, functional ships a bizarre and unwelcome intrusion. Before Vorian could even formulate a question, the human fleet acted. They bypassed all diplomatic protocols, ignored the unfolding battle between Cyrran and Xylos, and turned their prows toward the enemy. A new, more primal energy signature flared across their ships. It was not the clean hum of an energy capacitor charging, but the raw, violent tremor of immense mechanical forces being brought to bear. The bridge of the unrelenting was a place of quiet, focused intensity. It was cramped, utilitarian, and smelled faintly of scrubbed air and hot metal. There were no holographic projectors, only hardened screens bolted directly to the bulkheads. Every surface was padded, every console designed to be operated in high-G maneuvers. It was a warship built by a species that understood violence not as an elegant duel of energies, a contest of shields and beams, but as a dirty, physical business of stress limits and impact velocities. Commander Alex Ryder stood with his feet planted wide on the vibrating deck plate, one hand gripping an overhead support rail. He was a man built like his ship, solid, functional, with no wasted space. His dark hair was cropped short, and his face, etched with the fine lines of someone who spent more time looking at tactical displays than open skies, was calm. His gaze was fixed on the main screen, which showed the Xylos fleet advancing on the beleaguered Cyrrans. "Status Ava," he said, his voice a low baritone that cut through the low hum of the ship's systems. Tactical Officer Eva Rostova, his second-in-command, didn't look up from her station. Her fingers moved in a blur across her console, her lean frame taut with concentration. "Cyrran fleet is 60% neutralized," she reported, her voice crisp and precise. "Their energy weapons show zero effect on the hostiles. Planetary shield is critical. Hostiles are moving into optimal position for planetary bombardment. We are in the calculated firing window, Commander." "Load main batteries. Standard kinetic slugs. Target their lead dreadnought," Alex ordered. He looked at the Cyrran ships, sleek and beautiful even as they died. They fought with light and energy. They had forgotten the simple, brutal truth that had shaped every aspect of human military evolution. The universe always respected mass. "Main batteries loaded," Eva confirmed. "Targeting solution locked on hostile Alpha. We're green across the board." "Fire." The unrelenting shuddered, a deep, resonant tremor that was felt more in the teeth than heard with the ears. On the screen, the ship's primary cannons, 3 massive forward-mounted railguns, were wreathed in a brief flash of actinic blue light as immense magnetic fields contracted. 3 solid slugs of dense, refined tungsten, each the size of a ground transport, were hurled into the void at a significant fraction of the speed of light. They did not glow. They did not announce their presence with a crackle of energy. They were simply a declaration of physics, a delivery of kinetic force across a vast distance. Simultaneously, the other 11 ships of the human fleet opened fire. A storm of smaller, faster projectiles from their secondary batteries joined the main salvo, a silent, deadly cloud of metal streaking toward the Xylos fleet. From the bridge of the Radiant Dawn, Admiral Vorian watched the human ships act with a speed that bordered on insanity. They had not hailed him. They had not asked for a tactical briefing. They had simply appeared and opened fire with what his sensors identified as solid-state projectiles. It was archaic, barbaric. It was the warfare of primitives, throwing rocks in a battle of gods. He felt a surge of pity for them. They had jumped into their own graves, honed their bravado a final pointless gesture. "Their weapons are inert slugs, Admiral," his tactical officer confirmed, his voice laced with disbelief. "No energy signature beyond the kinetic release from their launch systems." "They will have no effect," Vorian said, turning his attention back to the more pressing matter of his own dying fleet. The human intervention was a distraction, a brief and tragic sideshow. He had to decide which of his ships could be saved, which sectors of the capital city to abandon first. But then the sensor technician gasped. "Admiral, the trajectory of those projectiles, the velocity it's staggering. They will reach the Xylos fleet in 3-2. Vorian turned back to the screen just as the first salvo arrived. He expected the slugs to splatter harmlessly against the Xylos hull, their energy absorbed like every other weapon thrown at them. He expected them to be a final futile gesture before the human ships were inevitably swatted from the sky. He did not expect them to work. There was no explosion, there was no brilliant flare of energy signifying a shield being overwhelmed. There was only the moment of contact, a silent, terrible meeting of irresistible force and a seemingly immovable object. The first of the Unrelenting's tungsten slugs, traveling at a velocity that warped the very fabric of space-time before it, struck the lead Xylos dreadnought. For a fraction of a second, nothing seemed to happen. The slug was simply gone, vanished into the crystalline hull. Admiral Vorian felt a grim, vindicating certainty. It had failed, just as he knew it would. Then he saw it. A flicker, a tiny hairline crack originating from the point of impact. The crack did not radiate heat or light. It was a line of pure physical failure, a place where the molecular bonds of the Xylos ship had been subjected to a stress they could not contain. This single crack spider-webbed outwards, branching into 1,000, then 1,000,000 new fissures in the space of a heartbeat. The entire forward section of the dreadnought, a vessel that had shrugged off the focused fire of a dozen Cyrran cruisers, was suddenly latticed with a network of catastrophic fractures. The sight was mesmerizing in its horror. The ship was not melting or burning, it was disintegrating. It was coming apart like a sheet of glass struck by a hammer. The Cyrran bridge crew, who had watched their most advanced weapons fail for hours, could only stare in stunned silence. The tactical display, which had shown the Xylos dreadnought as a single solid entity, now depicted it as a rapidly expanding cloud of fragments. The ship didn't even have time to die, it simply ceased to be. The rest of the human salvo arrived a moment later. All across the Xylos front line, the scene was repeated. Smaller Xylos cruisers, struck by the faster secondary rounds, shattered instantly. Larger vessels hit by multiple slugs broke apart in massive crystalline chunks that tumbled silently through the void. The impassive, silent advance of the enemy fleet was broken, their orderly formation thrown into chaos as their lead elements were violently and comprehensively unmade. On the bridge of the Unrelenting, there was no celebration. The crew watched the results of their volley with the detached professionalism of artisans inspecting their work. Impacts confirmed, Eva Rostova reported. Hostile Alpha confirmed destroyed. Multiple secondary targets neutralized. The crystalline structure is highly susceptible to kinetic shock. It doesn't deform or ablate, it shatters. As predicted, Alex said, his knuckles white on the support rail. He had seen the analysis from the deep space probes that had first encountered the Xylos on the galactic frontier. He had trusted the cold, hard numbers. Their energy absorption capability creates a rigid lattice. Too rigid. There's no give to it. Reload main batteries. Target the command and control node identified by the long-range scan. Reloading, Eva confirmed. Targeting hostile beta. They're adapting. I'm seeing minor fluctuations in their energy fields. They might be attempting to create some kind of kinetic buffer. It won't be enough, Alex stated. Not for this. Admiral Vorian could not process what he was seeing. The battle had been turned on its head in less than a minute. The invincible enemy was being broken apart by the crudest form of warfare imaginable. It defied every tactical model, every law of advanced combat. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the universe itself had been tilted on its axis. "Analysis," he croaked, his voice hoarse. "Explain what just happened." His chief engineer stared at the screen, his mouth slightly agape. "Admiral, it's the physics. We've spent generations developing weapons that deliver energy. Lances, particle beams, plasma, they all rely on thermal and energetic transfer. The Xylos evolved to counter that. They absorb and dissipate energy. But they never evolved a defense against a simple application of overwhelming force. A rock. The humans, they just threw a very, very fast rock." Vorian looked at the human fleet, their ugly functional ships now maneuvering to line up another shot. He had dismissed them as primitives, as barbarians. He saw now that he had been profoundly wrong. They were not fighting a more primitive war. They were fighting a different one based on a foundation of physical violence his people had long since forgotten. And in this battle against this foe, their primitive way was proving to be devastatingly superior. The silent, crystalline gods that had haunted his fleet were, for the first time, being shattered. The initial shock on the Cyrran bridge gave way to a dawning, terrifying awe. This was not a lucky shot. It was a strategy. The human fleet moved with a brutal, methodical grace, their movements lacking the elegance of Cyrran warships, but possessing a clear, undeniable purpose. They advanced in a staggered formation, a fist of overlapping fire arcs. Each ship in the human fleet was a cog in a perfectly synchronized machine of destruction. Eva Rostova's voice was a calm, steady presence on the Unrelenting's bridge, a counterpoint to the deep percussive thud of the railguns firing. Delta Wing. Adjust trajectory 3 degrees port. Focus fire on the cluster at Mark 7 Niner. We need to break up their secondary line before they can regroup. Acknowledged came the clipped response from another ship's captain. The human fleet's fire was not a desperate barrage. It was a calculated dissection. Eva's tactical display was a complex web of trajectories, impact probabilities, and material stress analysis. She was not just shooting at ships. She was targeting the specific points where a kinetic strike would inflict maximum structural damage using the Cyrran's passive sensor data to pinpoint vulnerabilities in the crystalline lattice. It was the work of a butcher, but a butcher with the precision of a surgeon. The battle became a grim, grinding affair. The Xylos, for all their unique defenses, were not without teeth. As the human ships pushed deeper into their formation, they began to take fire from the Xylos' secondary weapons, smaller, self-guided crystalline shards that were fired like missiles. Unlike the Cyrran ships, the human vessels did not have sophisticated energy shields. Their defense was simpler and far more direct, thick, layered armor plating. On the main view screen, Vorian watched as a human cruiser, the Boulder, took a volley of shards across its bow. The impacts were not silent. They were savage, gouging deep trenches in the dark metal of the hull. One shard, larger than the rest, punched through the outer armor. A silent puff of white vapor, frozen atmosphere and debris, erupted from the wound. Red emergency lights flickered to life inside the breached section, visible through the gash. A Cyrran officer gasped, "They're hit! Hull breach on the human cruiser!" Vorian expected the ship to fall back, to disengage. It did not. The red lights were quickly replaced by the stark white glow of emergency force fields sealing the breach from within. The ship barely altered its course. A moment later, its own cannons answered with a retaliatory salvo, firing with the same steady rhythm as before. The Cyrrans watched, transfixed. Their own ships were marvels of technology, but they were delicate. A single well-placed physical impact could shatter their sensitive energy conduits and disable the entire vessel. The human ships, however, were built to endure this kind of punishment. They were designed with redundancies, compartmentalized sections, and heavy internal bracing. They were built with the expectation of taking damage, of being punched and continuing to fight. It was a design philosophy born from a history of brutal close-quarters combat that the Cyrrans could barely comprehend. "Eva, damage report on the Boulder," Alex commanded, his eyes never leaving the tactical plot. "Compartments 6 through 9 on the forward deck are sealed. Life support is compromised in that section, but the crew evacuated to the central core. Structural integrity is at 91%. Her combat effectiveness is undiminished," Eva reported coolly. "Tell Captain Reese to maintain his position. He's drawing their fire, opening up a lane for us." "Aye, Commander." The battle was not clean. It was a bloody physical brawl fought in the cold vacuum of space. The humans were trading blows, accepting damage and losses with a stoicism that bordered on inhuman. They were not winning through superior technology in the way the Cyrrans understood it. They were winning through superior endurance, superior tactical discipline, and an unflinching acceptance of the cost of victory. They were grinding the Xylos fleet down, ship by shattered ship, paying for every meter of ground with scarred metal, and undoubtedly the lives of their crew. For the Cyrrans, who viewed warfare as a near-bloodless contest of energy and wit, this was a horrifying revelation. The humans were not just warriors, they were grinders, willing to throw themselves into the gears of the machine to make it stop. And against the silent, impassive Xylos, that was the only strategy that worked. The Xylos were not unintelligent. They were a force of nature, but nature adapts. As their fleet was systematically shattered by a form of violence it had never encountered, the surviving ships began to change their tactics. At the heart of their remaining formation, a massive Xylos dreadnought, larger than any vessel Alex had ever seen, began to emit a new kind of energy. It was not a weapon, but a defense. "Gravity distortion," Eva announced, her calm tone finally tinged with urgency. "The primary hostile is generating a localized gravimetric field. It's wrapping around their formation like a shield." On the tactical display, Alex saw it. The space around the Xylos dreadnought was warping, bending the light from distant stars. It was a wall of pure gravity, an elegant and powerful defense against any projectile. Any slug fired into that field would be deflected, its trajectory bent harmlessly away. The Xylos had found an answer to the kinetic assault. Admiral Vorian watched from his bridge, a knot of ice forming in his stomach. He had allowed himself a sliver of hope, and now it was being extinguished. Gravity manipulation was a field of science far beyond even the Cyrrans. It was the perfect defense. The human's brutal advantage was gone. But on the bridge of the Unrelenting, there was no panic. Alex looked at the distorted space on his screen, his expression one of intense calculation. He had hoped he wouldn't have to show this hand. The Terran Defense Force preferred to keep its deepest secrets. But there was no choice. The Xylos could not be allowed to survive this encounter. They could not be allowed to report back on humanity's capabilities. "Eva," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "authorize Protocol Chimera, load the main batteries with variable mass shells, full power to the drive capacitors." Eva's head snapped up, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. She gave a single sharp nod. "Protocol Chimera authorized, loading VMS rounds, drive capacitors charging." A new energy signature began to build within the human fleet, a deep, resonant thrum that was vastly more powerful than the simple electromagnetic charge of the railguns. On the radiant dawn, Vorian's engineering officer cried out in alarm. "Admiral, the human ships, their energy output is spiking. It's not their weapons, it's their core drives. The readings, they make no sense." The Unrelenting's cannons fired again. The shells that emerged looked identical to the previous slugs, inert chunks of metal hurled into the void. They soared towards the Xylos dreadnought and the shimmering wall of distorted gravity that protected it. As they entered the gravimetric field, Vorian expected them to be cast aside. They were not. The moment the shells hit the edge of the distortion, a brilliant blue-white light flared around each one. It was not a shield or an explosion. It was the light of physics being fundamentally rewritten. Instead of being deflected, the shells accelerated. They plunged into the gravity well, their velocity increasing exponentially as their own drive systems, a technology the Cyrrans couldn't begin to comprehend, interacted with the field. The lead shell struck the Xylos dreadnought. The resulting impact was not just an impact. It was an event on the level of a cosmic cataclysm. The force delivered was orders of magnitude greater than what a simple tungsten slug should have been able to produce. The dreadnought did not just shatter. It was annihilated, vaporized in a flash of pure kinetic energy that was so intense it momentarily blinded the Cyrran sensors. The gravimetric field collapsed with it, the shockwave of its demise rocking ships hundreds of kilometers away. Admiral Vorian fell back into his command chair, his mind reeling. He finally understood. The humans' primitive weapons were a lie, a facade. Their true advantage wasn't their cannons, it was their drive system. It was a drive that didn't just move their ships, it manipulated mass itself. They weren't just launching inert slugs, they were launching projectiles that could become momentarily impossibly heavy at the point of impact. Their entire technological tree was built on a branch of physics the rest of the galaxy dismissed as a theoretical dead end, an unsolvable paradox. The humans had solved it, and they had turned it into a weapon of terrifying power. In the stunned silence that followed the dreadnought's annihilation, a new icon blinked on Admiral Vorian's command console, an incoming communication request from the human flagship. After a moment's hesitation, he gestured to his communications officer. On screen. The face that appeared was stark, human, and framed by the harsh lighting of a military bridge. Commander Alex Ryder looked directly at him, his gaze unwavering, his expression unreadable. There were no formal greetings, no diplomatic overtures. "Admiral Vorian," Ryder began, his voice a calm, direct baritone, My tactical officer requires access to your fleet's high-resolution sensor logs on the Xylos ship structures. We need real-time data on their internal crystalline formations and stress propagation patterns under kinetic impact. Vorian stared, momentarily speechless. The request was as alien as the technology the humans had just displayed. He had expected a boast, a demand for surrender of the Xylos, or perhaps an explanation. Instead, he got a technical request phrased in a language of brutal physicality. He wasn't asking about energy frequencies or shield harmonics, the lexicon of Cyrran warfare. He was asking for schematics of how best to break something. "You want our sensor logs?" Vorian asked, his voice betraying his astonishment. "Your sensors are more sophisticated than ours for passive scanning," Ryder stated, as if it were a simple, obvious fact. "They can map the internal lattice structure of the Xylos hulls. We can use that data to identify primary load-bearing nodes. It will allow us to neutralize their remaining vessels with greater efficiency. A single, well-placed shot instead of a saturation barrage. It will conserve our ammunition." The sheer pragmatism was chilling. He spoke of shattering enemy ships with the detached air of a quarry master planning his next blast. One of Vorian's advisors, a high-ranking minister who had been on the bridge throughout the ordeal, stepped forward. "Admiral, you cannot! Sharing that level of data with an unknown non-hegemony force is a violation of a dozen security protocols." Vorian silenced him with a sharp glance. Security protocols. What did they matter now? His fleet was crippled. His planet had been moments from extinction, and his entire understanding of galactic power had been upended. These humans, these primitives, were the only reason he was still breathing. Their methods were brutal, their technology was terrifying, but they were undeniably effective, and their commander was not asking for permission, he was stating a tactical necessity. He looked back at the human commander's face on the screen. He saw no malice there, no deception. He saw only a grim, unwavering focus, the look of a man who had a job to do and would remove any obstacle that stood in his way. In that moment, Vorian made a decision. He was a military commander, and the war was not yet won. The logical choice was the one that led to victory. "Commander Ryder," Vorian said, his voice now firm, regaining the authority of his rank. "You will have our sensor data. I am slaving the Radiant Dawn's primary tactical sensor network to your flagship. Use it as you see fit." The minister gasped, but Vorian ignored him. A flicker of something, perhaps respect, passed through Ryder's eyes. It was gone as quickly as it came. "Acknowledged, Admiral. My tactical officer will begin integration immediately. Stand by." The channel closed. Vorian turned to his tactical officer. "Do it. Give them everything they need." "Admiral, are you certain?" the officer asked, his hand hovering over the console. "Yes," Vorian said, his gaze returning to the view screen where the human fleet was repositioning, moving with a newfound deadly confidence. "Our language of war has failed us. It is time we learn to speak theirs." The Cyrran bridge crew could only watch as their most advanced systems were handed over to the strangers, their ship's senses becoming the eyes for the humans' unseen fist. They were no longer just witnesses to this battle, they were participants in a new and terrifying form of combat. On the bridge of the Unrelenting, the flood of Cyrran data was a river of light pouring into Eva Rostova's console. The Cyrran sensors, designed for the subtle art of detecting energy fluctuations across vast distances, were now being repurposed for a far more brutal task. Eva's fingers flew across her controls, her mind processing the alien data streams with terrifying speed. She was no longer just a gunner, she was a sculptor, and her chisel was a volley of hypervelocity tungsten. "The Cyrran data is clean," she announced, her eyes fixed on a three-dimensional, translucent model of a Xylos cruiser that now floated above her console. It was a ghost ship, rendered in lines of golden light. "Their passive resonance scanners give us a complete internal schematic. I'm isolating the primary power conduits and the core lattice stabilizers." Within the golden ghost, new lines of harsh red light appeared, tracing paths deep inside the crystalline structure. They were the ship's bones, the load-bearing frameworks that held the entire vessel together. "Commander," she said, her voice sharp with discovery, "their design has a critical flaw. The energy absorption systems are routed through a central crystalline nexus. It's a bottleneck. If we can shatter that nexus, the entire ship should lose structural integrity. It's like striking the keystone of an arch. Alex stepped closer, his eyes on the glowing schematic. A single point of failure. For every one of their ship classes, Eva confirmed. It's a standardized design. The Cyrrans were trying to brute force the hull. They were shooting at the walls. The Cyrran data lets us aim for the pillar. Then give our gunners their targets, Alex ordered. The nature of the battle changed instantly. The human fleet, which had been fighting like a blunt instrument, now began to operate with the precision of a scalpel. The fire orders that went out from the Unrelenting were no longer for saturation, but for surgical strikes. A human destroyer, the Hammer, swiveled its main cannon. It fired a single shot. The projectile was not a standard slug, but a smaller, denser penetrator round, guided by the ghost data provided by the Cyrrans. It struck a Xylos cruiser not in the center of its mass, but at an obscure, seemingly unimportant point near its engine assembly. From the radiant dawn, Admiral Vorian watched the shot travel. It looked like a miss. But when the round hit, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The Xylos cruiser did not shatter from the outside in. It imploded. The single, perfectly placed shot had broken the ship's spine. The internal forces holding the crystalline structure together were released, and the ship collapsed in on itself before bursting outward in a silent, glittering cloud. One shot, one kill. All across the void, the human ships repeated the feat. They were no longer brawlers. They were snipers. Guided by the senses of the Cyrran fleet, their kinetic weapons had become instruments of impossible precision. The remaining Xylos vessels, which had been attempting to regroup, were now being picked apart with an efficiency that was horrifying to behold. Their formations broke completely. The silent, impassive gods of the void were being dismantled, piece by piece, by an enemy that could now see their souls. Eva Rostova was at the center of this storm of perfect violence. Her face was illuminated by the soft glow of her console, a mask of pure concentration. She was in a state of flow, a perfect union of human tactical intellect, alien sensor technology, and the brutal physics of the mass drive. She was the ghost in the machine, the guiding hand for a fleet of hammers, and with every ship she targeted, she was rewriting the rules of naval warfare. The Cyrrans had provided the eyes, but it was her mind that guided the fist. The combination was more devastating than either civilization could have been on its own. The remaining Xylos ships, once a terrifying, unstoppable force, were now just targets on a list, waiting to be crossed off. For the first time since the Cyrran hegemony had encountered them, the Xylos faltered. It was not a rout, not yet, but it was a hesitation, a break in the impassive, relentless advance that had been their defining characteristic. From the bridge of the Radiant Dawn, Admiral Vorian watched the tactical display and saw something he never thought he would see. The Xylos fleet was no longer advancing. Their forward momentum had ceased. Some ships were even beginning to drift backward, their movements uncoordinated, chaotic. "What are they doing?" a junior officer asked, his voice filled with a hopeful tremor. "They're confused," Vorian breathed, his eyes wide. "We've never been able to destroy them this efficiently. They've never faced an enemy that could truly systemically hurt them. Look at their energy signatures." The data streams confirmed his observation. The Xylos ships, which normally maintained a steady low-level energy output, were now showing erratic spikes. Their internal systems were in flux. They were adapting, yes, but not in a coordinated, strategic way. It was the frantic, panicked response of an organism in pain. They were trying to generate defensive fields, trying to reroute power, trying to understand how an enemy could suddenly see into their very bones. The most telling sign came moments later. A wing of 3 Xylos cruisers, which had been the target of the next human volley, suddenly changed vector. They did not turn to fight. They turned to flee. Their energy signatures flared as their drives began to charge for an FTL jump, a process that, for their unique biology, was slow and deliberate. "They're running," the tactical officer whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. "The Xylos are running!" The whisper spread across the Cyrran bridge like wildfire. Hope, a feeling that had been extinguished hours ago, was rekindled. The crew looked at each other, their faces a mixture of shock and elation. The gods were bleeding, and now they were afraid. This single act of retreat was more significant than any of the destroyed ships. It was a concession of defeat. It was the acknowledgement that they had encountered a predator superior to themselves. On the unrelenting Alex Rider saw the same thing. "They're breaking," he said, his voice flat. "They're trying to disengage." "Their FTL charge-up is slow," Eva reported, her analysis instantaneous. "We have a window of approximately 90 seconds before the first group can jump." Alex's expression hardened. He knew what he had to do. There could be no survivors. An enemy this powerful could not be allowed to escape, to report back on humanity's existence, on their location, on their capabilities. The isolation that had protected Earth for so long was a strategic asset, one he would not squander. Mercy had no place in this calculation. "All ships," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Pursuit formation. Do not let a single one of them escape the system. Target their drives first, cripple them, then finish them, no quarter." The order was chilling in its finality. The Cyrrans on the Radiant Dawn's bridge, listening in on the open channel Alex had left for them, fell silent. Their own doctrine called for allowing a defeated enemy to retreat with honor. It was a core tenet of their civilized approach to warfare. The humans, it was now terrifyingly clear, did not share that philosophy. They were not here to win a battle. They were here to exterminate a threat. Vorian watched as the human fleet, without a moment's hesitation, surged forward, their engines flaring with a brutal efficiency. They were not liberators in the way the Cyrrans understood the word. They were something far older, far more primal. They were predators, and their prey was now in flight. The elation on the Cyrran bridge curdled into a new, more complex emotion, a deep and profound fear of their saviors. The hunt was on. The vast, silent theater of war, once a static defensive line, became a dynamic, three-dimensional chase. The human fleet, freed from the need to protect the Cyrran capital, transformed into a pack of wolves running down a scattered herd. Their movements were a testament to the brutal superiority of their drive technology in sublight engagements. Where the Xylos ships were ponderous, their energy-based drives requiring time to build momentum, the human vessels were agile and terrifyingly quick. The combination of their powerful, primitive chemical thrusters for raw acceleration and the subtle, constant manipulation of their own mass via their core drives gave them an edge in maneuverability that was simply insurmountable. They could pivot on a dime, accelerate to flank speed in seconds, and brake just as hard. Commander Ryder stood on the bridge of the Unrelenting, a grim statue amidst the controlled chaos. "Eva, give me a pursuit plot for the lead escapee group." "Plot on screen, Commander," she responded instantly. "They're heading for the system's edge, but their acceleration curve is flat. We can intercept." "Designate them Strike Package Alpha," Alex ordered. "Dispatch the hammer and the anvil. Their orders are to disable, not destroy, until the rest of the fleet is dealt with. I want them anchored." Orders relayed. Vorian watched this unfold from his own bridge, a helpless observer to a form of warfare he was only now beginning to grasp. The humans were not just fighting, they were managing a kill box. Their communication was terse, efficient, and utterly ruthless. They were coordinating to cut off all escape routes to ensure the annihilation was total. A pair of human destroyers broke from the main formation, their engines flaring brightly as they accelerated on an intercept course with the fastest of the fleeing Xylos. They didn't fire their main cannons. Instead, they launched a volley of what looked like harpoons, tethered by shimmering energy cables. The projectiles struck the Xylos cruisers, their tips burrowing into the crystalline hulls. The moment they anchored, the human ships reversed their thrusters, becoming immense drag chutes. The Xylos ships, caught by the tethers, were yanked from their escape trajectory, their forward momentum stolen. They were trapped, tethered like beasts caught in a snare. The main human fleet, meanwhile, focused on the larger, slower cluster of Xylos ships at the center of the broken formation. The surgical precision of the earlier battle was gone, replaced by an overwhelming application of force. They were no longer conserving ammunition. Volley after volley of variable mass shells and standard kinetic slugs tore into the enemy, shattering hulls and extinguishing lives with methodical fury. It was a massacre. The Xylos, stripped of their invulnerability and their confidence, were now just targets. Their attempts to fight back were sporadic and ineffective. Their shard weapons, so deadly against the fragile Cyrran ships, scarred and damaged the human vessels, but failed to stop them. A human cruiser might lose an engine, a destroyer might have its communication array sheared off, but the fleet as a whole absorbed the damage and pressed its attack without pause. The final moments of the battle were a grim spectacle of overwhelming force. The last Xylos dreadnought, crippled and adrift, was surrounded by 4 human ships. They did not circle it like scavengers. They took up positions, aimed their main batteries, and at Ryder's command fired a single synchronized volley. The dreadnought ceased to exist in a silent flash of released kinetic energy. Ryder watched the last hostile icon disappear from the tactical map. The space around Syrra, once filled with a silent, crystalline menace, was now a glittering graveyard of inert fragments, a testament to the totality of the human victory. He allowed himself a single slow breath. The threat was contained. "All ships," he commanded, his voice echoing in the sudden quiet of the bridge. "Cease fire. Begin damage control and say our operations for our own crews. Report casualties." The butcher's bill had come due. Now it was time to count the cost. The silence that descended upon the void was profound. The chaotic energy of the battle was gone, replaced by an unnerving stillness. The space around Syrra was now a vast, slowly expanding debris field of shattered crystal, glittering like 1,000,000,000,000 broken diamonds in the light of the distant star. The human fleet, scarred and battered, drifted amongst the wreckage, their searchlights cutting sharp, white lines through the darkness as they tended to their wounded and accounted for their dead. Admiral Vorian stood on the bridge of the radiant dawn, the weight of the past few hours pressing down on him. His planet was safe. His people were alive. But the relief he should have felt was overshadowed by a deep, unsettling awe. He looked at the human ships on his view screen, their ugly, practical forms scorched and breached, venting atmosphere from a dozen wounds, yet still stubbornly, defiantly functional. They were victors, but they wore the cost of their victory openly. The communication channel from the Unrelenting opened one last time. Commander Ryder's face appeared, and for the first time, Vorian saw the weariness etched around the man's eyes. The commander's composure was still absolute, but the battle had taken its toll. "Admiral," Ryder began, his voice low and steady, "the immediate threat has been neutralized. My fleet has sustained damage and will require time for field repairs before we can depart." Vorian inclined his head, a gesture of profound respect. "Commander Ryder, on behalf of the Cyrran hegemony, there are no words in my language to express the debt we owe you. You saved my world. You saved my people." Ryder's expression did not change. "We didn't do it for you, Admiral." The statement was not meant to be cruel. It was a simple declaration of fact. The Xylos are a contagion. They assimilate or destroy all life they encounter. Our long-range probes mark them as an extinction-level threat. Your system was simply the battlefield where we chose to intercept them. The cold, strategic reality of Ryder's words settled over Vorian. They had not been rescued by noble allies. They had been the fortunate beneficiaries of a pest control operation. Who are you?" Vorian asked, the question that had been burning in his mind since the first Xylos ship shattered. "The Terran Defense Force is not listed in any galactic charter. Your technology, your entire philosophy of war, it is unknown." Ryder was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant, as if he were weighing his words. "We are the descendants of a species that nearly destroyed itself a dozen times over. We learned our lessons in blood and fire. We learned that there are some threats that cannot be reasoned with, some ideologies that cannot be tolerated. We learned that the universe does not reward elegance or honor as much as it respects overwhelming, decisive force." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking with Vorian's. "We are humanity, and our specialty is providing permanent solutions to intractable problems. Consider your problem solved." The channel closed, leaving Vorian alone with the commander's final chilling words. He looked away from the screen, out at the human fleet. He thought of their brutal efficiency, their acceptance of cost, their terrifying mass-drive technology, and their absolute refusal to let a single enemy escape. They were not the primitives the galaxy had dismissed them as. They were something far more formidable. They were a species forged in a crucible of violence so intense it had taught them to wield the fundamental forces of the universe as a weapon. The Cyrran hegemony was safe, but the galaxy was not the same. It was now a place that contained humanity. Vorian looked at the scarred victorious ships and understood. He was not looking at saviors. He was looking at the new gods of war, and their Bible was written in the language of physics, in chapters of mass, velocity, and force. It was a language the rest of the galaxy would now have to learn, very, very quickly.